In late March of 2006, police officers arrived at Sheila LaBarre's ranch to confront her over the disappearance of one of her partners. Upon arrival, they found 2 active sites burning, with large bones visible from the flames. This spurred them to search within the home, and what they found inside was a lot more than they had bargained for. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime. My name is Adrian, and in this video we're talking about the case of Sheila LaBarre. A disturbing childhood, BDSM, gold digging, and multiple murders. This case really does have it all. And by the way, I post solved, unsolved, and strange cases here on a weekly basis, so if that's of interest to you, please consider subscribing to Coffeehouse Crime. Now there is a lot to unpack in today's case, so let's get straight into it. Pull up a seat, grab a coffee, and sit back. This is the case of Sheila LaBarre. Good morning, America. Our story today takes us to the east coast of the United States, and more specifically to New Hampshire. Famous for its large stretches of wilderness, abundance in wildlife, and its rather sparse population, many of New Hampshire's towns are rural and small, and in short, there's not much going on here. Due to its influence from European architecture, many of these towns are often described as picturesque, with special thanks from the Swedes. And it's in New Hampshire that we find the home of Sheila LaBarre, a middle-aged woman living on a horse ranch in Epping. Born on July 4th, 1958, Sheila Bailey began her life in Fort Payne, Alabama. She was the youngest of 6, consisting of 3 sons and 3 daughters, and this meant that Sheila always strived to stand out from the rest of her siblings, eager to please her parents and often acting out for attention. Although Sheila was fortunate to have both of her parents, there were several issues, and being honest, she may have been better off with just the one. Her father, Manuel, struggled with bouts of alcoholism, and this often resulted in physical and verbal abuse towards Sheila, her siblings, and her mother. Things were so bad that one night the family were chased out of their house by their father while he threw household objects at them. This included full cans of antifreeze, and one of these cans would hit 6-year-old Sheila square in the face, an action that left a permanent scar on her. Fleeing into a nearby cornfield, the family hid while they waited for Manuel to retreat. And when he did, they made a 5-mile walk to stay with their family in the middle of the night. Unfortunately, the abuse wouldn't stop there, as Sheila and one of her other sisters claimed that their father would regularly assault them from a very young age. But nevertheless, throughout all this hardship, Sheila would eventually graduate from Fort Payne High School at the age of 18. With thanks to her birthday being on Independence Day and her very fiery personality, Sheila was adequately nicknamed as the Firecracker. Although Sheila may have been erratic in her young age, she was also very eager to please and was a very ambitious young woman. She had aspirations to be a country singer or a model. She wanted to be seen and earn lots of money doing so. This wasn't necessarily unachievable, as Sheila was considered to be very beautiful at the time, which she often used to her advantage against the men. But unfortunately, her ambitions would never work out, and instead she ended up becoming a housekeeper at a local motel along with her sister, which helped support the family. At the age of 23, Sheila met a young man by the name of John Baxter. John was 19 and had a young daughter with another woman. A whirlwind romance blossomed, and on New Year's Eve in 1981, the young couple tied the knot. There is actually no point in showing an image of him, as this marriage lasted for only 6 weeks. John discovered that while working away from home, Sheila had been locking his daughter in a tiny closet whenever she acted up. Now, understandably, John was furious at the situation. He saw the red flags. He took no time in protecting his daughter and abruptly divorcing Sheila. However, the divorce didn't seem to faze her, as soon after this she was quickly hopping from one relationship to another. This eventually led her to meet a man named Ronnie Jennings. Sheila and Ronnie had a crazy and turbulent 4-year marriage. Ronnie was often unfaithful, and Sheila was prone to mood swings which often turned violent. In one altercation, Sheila demanded a divorce. But when Ronnie refused, she caught his attention by downing a bottle of pills and stealing his car. All of this leading to a sudden crash. Blacking out behind the wheel held dire consequences. Fortunately, no one else was hurt, but for Sheila it was a different story. She was airlifted to hospital, causing enough serious injuries to stay in a coma for 8 days. And to add to this, she had to have her stomach pumped with thanks to the pills. Returning to Ronnie after being released from hospital, the two attempted to repair their marriage by moving to Chattanooga. But sadly, their relationship would do nothing but deteriorate. Eventually, Sheila began to seriously threaten Ronnie, and after threatening to kill him with scissors in his sleep, he ended the relationship and moved out, finally resulting in divorce. When questioned, Ronnie described Sheila as, "She's just crazy, to put it bluntly. Sheila doesn't care about anyone else, she just wants everything her way." Which is rather fitting, as Sheila always strived to be the dominant figure in her relationships, both in and outside of the bedroom, if you know what I mean. Following the termination of her marriage, Sheila then steamrolled through a number of boyfriends, many of which she found through personal ads in newspapers and magazines. Now, Sheila often received attention from men, this wasn't new, but she wasn't looking for the outgoing, strong, or independent types. Instead, she wanted someone she could control and dominate. Personal ads were a perfect way to do this, and these advertisements often expressed the characteristics she was looking for. And lo and behold, it's here that one day, Sheila found Dr. Bill LaBarre. So, what can I say here? Bill was an affluent 60-year-old man. He was a chiropractor, and he lived on a 150-acre horse ranch in Epping, New Hampshire. Sheila noticed his wealth, and in fact, she was very quick to send Bill several nude photos of herself to appease him. And Bill loved it. He was very taken by the younger woman, and he began to buy her many expensive gifts. The relationship became more serious, and in 1987, Sheila moved in with Bill on his ranch. And although Bill and Sheila would never marry, Sheila started to use LaBarre as a last name. Bill was very happy about this. He now had a beautiful common-law wife who was almost half of his age. But very little did he realise that this meant he could no longer keep any of his other girlfriends. You see, Sheila very much wanted to be the dominant one in their relationship, so she drove away all of Bill's other partners. But to contradict this in her own eyes, she was still allowed to have her own fun elsewhere. Sheila strung along multiple men while living with Bill. Her so-called dominance in their life remained clear, and, no pun intended, she also inserted herself into his financial and professional life too, becoming a manager at his company and taking control of his finances as he grew older. Outside of the house, her external partnerships were turbulent, and when I say these relationships were a mess, that's an understatement. One of which was with a Jamaican man named Wayne Ennis, who Sheila had hired to work on the farm. Sheila claims that Bill was supportive of her having other lovers, so much so that Wayne moved into the house on the ranch with Sheila and Bill. However, these terms and conditions didn't seem to be mutually understood, as Sheila would eventually file an assault charge against Wayne after he found her in bed with yet another man. The charges were eventually dropped, and to add to this shitstorm, Sheila and Wayne would soon after get married, although Sheila wouldn't take Wayne's last name and instead kept Bill's. After a slew of assault charges and a restraining order, Sheila eventually divorced Wayne, and again she would swiftly move on to her next boyfriend, James Brackett. We're fleeting over the details here, but James was much more submissive when compared to Wayne. However, their relationship would quickly nosedive after Sheila was charged with assaulting him, trying to run him over with her pickup truck, scratching and gouging his face, and even firing a gun at him, which luckily missed. Right, I'm giving all of you a brief moment here to breathe and process these relationships, as it paints a very clear picture of Sheila's demeanour. She was turbulent, violent, and volatile. All of these events take us up to the year 2000, and it's in December of this very same year that, sadly, Bill LaBarre naturally passed away. He made it to the age of 74. To the anger of Bill's children, and despite never actually marrying, Sheila was the one to inherit his wealth, horse ranch, chiropractic business, and rental home. Which does make you wonder, was this her plan all along? So naturally, this created conflict in the family. His children accused Sheila of poisoning Bill. However, Bill had an advanced heart disease, and ultimately died of heart failure, so it is really hard to calculate. With Bill no longer in the picture, Sheila had full control of the ranch, where she could now get up to as much mischief as she liked. No more negotiating, no more agreements, no more compromises. It was now all on her conditions, and unfortunately for some of her lovers, their trip to Sheila's ranch would be their last. We're now in the year 2003. 3 long years have passed since Bill's death, and Sheila was still living in the ranch by herself. This was despite several neighbours noticing many young men frequenting the home, many of which often stayed for days at a time. Sheila enjoyed the company, and she often tried to make them stay in any way possible. Tragically, this even included her seducing delivery men. She couldn't have been very good, as soon after this, many delivery companies refused to deliver to the ranch. Instead, she would call up maintenance companies, making up any excuse to get a handyman out to the ranch. Let's go one step further. Eventually, Sheila even targeted young men living rough on the streets, offering them a place to stay with drugs and sex on demand. And one of these vulnerable young men was 37-year-old Michael Deloge. Michael's story is a sad one. He was a loner who had little to no work experience, often suffered from bouts of homelessness, and had a drug addiction. So it's no wonder why he said yes when Sheila promised him financial security, a roof over his head, and affection. Michael eventually moved on to the ranch, where they then settled into a raunchy, ranchy lifestyle of BDSM, love, and sex, something that Sheila clearly enjoyed for many years. Now, most of us have heard of 50 Shades of Grey, but for those unaware, BDSM includes bondage and wearing fetish gear, where one person or a group of people often take a submissive role while being dominated by the other. Michael perfectly fit this submissive figure, while Sheila, on the other hand, was the blue balling, chain dangling, whip cracking dominatrix, the exact way she liked it. Sheila often took her role way too far, and she often did things that would otherwise be classed as abuse and mistreatment, often tying up and beating Michael. She would also exploit Michael for any money that he acquired. She had full control of his finances and claimed he wasn't responsible enough to spend wisely. Michael tried to leave a couple times, returning to a homeless shelter that he used to frequent. On more than one occasion, he walked 20 miles from the ranch to the shelter, citing that he had to get away from someone insane and controlling. However, every time he left, Sheila knew where he was going and would come for him. This routine became regular, until one cold evening in fall of 2005, Michael never returned to the shelter. Furthermore, he stopped calling his family, and he was never seen at the ranch ever again. Every now and then, Michael's family would receive a letter from him, but the subject matter was always horrific. At the end of the last letter, Michael wrote that he was now happy, would never be coming back, and not to call the police or come to the ranch ever again. It was almost as if these letters were not written by him. Sadly, since Michael was a loner, was often homeless and had drug issues, nobody batted an eyelid over his disappearance. At least not for now. Sheila carried on manipulating men into her home and of course into her bed, and to pay the bills she worked as a phone sex operator. And in February of 2006, this is how she met her next boy toy, 24-year-old Kenneth Countie. Kenny was described as a very friendly and likeable man who was always seen smiling. He had also served time in the military, but had since then been discharged. The old recruit was close with his family. In fact, his whole life revolved around them. And this was most likely because Kenny relied on them. You see, Kenny was a man with a low IQ, and unfortunately, he was diagnosed to have the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. In short, he was socially underprepared for most of his adult life. This, unfortunately, made him a very easy target for Sheila. Sheila sweet-talked her way into Kenny's mind. She managed to convince him to meet at a local hotel, where she then appeased Kenny with charming conversation and tantalizing words. And no surprise, they ended up having sex in her car in the parking lot. I never really understood that part. You meet at a hotel, but use the car? Sheila convinced Kenny to move in with her on the ranch, and she promised him a new life where they could have as much fun as they want. This, however, was not the life Kenny was given, and instead Sheila went straight back into her violent BDSM fantasies, with Kenny at her disposal. These sessions were violent, and left bruises, cuts, and burns all over Kenny's body. As a result, the man's health very visibly deteriorated. It didn't take long for people to notice this either. One image taken at the local Walmart showed Kenny in a wheelchair with several wounds. Most noticeable were the burns and cuts to his face. This raised suspicions amongst staff in Walmart, and eventually, after a heated argument, the police were called. Their excuses must have been sufficient, as Sheila and Kenny were allowed to leave, no further questions asked. And this was despite Kenny seeming very withdrawn and jumpy. During this altercation, Sheila referred to herself as a multimillionaire who owned a horse farm, which, let's be honest, was a very big stretch. She was also described as very angry, unreasonable, and very defensive. Not long after this incident in March of 2006, Kenny suddenly fell silent. His mother Carolyn was growing worried. She was no longer able to reach him, and when calling his friends and his place of work, no one else had heard from him either. She knew that Kenny had moved to Sheila's ranch, but after calling Sheila, the reception wasn't so welcoming. Instead, she told Carolyn to leave him the fuck alone, and that they were happy. Kenny was not a man who could take care of himself, and the silence was eating away at her. She therefore called the local sheriff's department, and after speaking to Sergeant Sean Gallagher, she officially reported her son, Kenny, as missing. Calling the LaBarre residence, Sean desperately tried to retrieve some information from Sheila. However, the home phone rang over and over again. There was no answer. Sheila now seemed to be radio silent too. That would be until 2 days later, when Sean finally received a phone call from Sheila. She told him that Kenny was no longer in the ranch, and instead he was on the run. Before Sean could even reply, he heard a heavy click on the other end of the line, followed by the crackling white noise of a tape recorder. Sheila then began to play the recording, and in this tape she began to say the names of several of Kenny's family members. She asked Kenny if he'd assaulted them, in which the tape recording would play a small voice back saying yes to all those questions. After this recording, she then ended the phone call. Sean was understandably disturbed by the phone call. It was 1 AM. Why had Sheila called him in the middle of the night to imply Kenny of multiple sex crimes? Later that day at 6 PM, Sean along with another officer made their way to the ranch in search for answers. Interesting side note, but police already knew of Sheila, and they'd been to the ranch several times before. But now, police officers would only go over in a pair or group, and can you guess why? Obviously, it's because Sheila would try to seduce the officer if he was alone. Anyway, this time upon arrival, there was no answer at the gate or the door. This was despite all vehicles being present at the address. They began to search the property, and while here, they came across an active burn site with a burnt mattress and a burning pile of hay. Approaching the burn site, officers could see a 3.5-inch bone in plain view. It appeared to be 1 inch thick, with burnt soft tissue still attached to it. Sean immediately called for backup, and while waiting, Sheila suddenly appeared at the front gate. Confronting her, officers began to question Sheila about the burn site and the bones, and in a matter-of-fact manner, Sheila replied with, "It's either a rabbit or a child molester." After a short dispute, she asked the officers to leave. Sheila couldn't be arrested for anything. There was no sufficient evidence despite the concerning details, so instead, a warrant was obtained. The very next day, with the warrant finally approved, a physical examination of the property began, and what officers would find was what they had feared the most. Blood was present on the kitchen cabinets, across the living room walls, and on several boxes located in the bedroom. The washing machine was full of clothing described as putrid and smelling of decomposition, and 2 empty canisters were located, both of which smelled like fuel. Tragically, these were the 2 canisters Kenny was holding in the Walmart picture. The bathtub upstairs was also found to contain traces of blood, as further did the sofa, kitchen wall, and various other items all over the house. Sheila had done a very poor job in cleaning up, and although an arrest warrant was issued for her, she was nowhere to be found. Nervous of what they may find, Sheila had actually run away and hitchhiked to Boston. And, would you believe, she had even slept with the man who randomly picked her up. In court documents, she had even claimed that she was an angel, and that he had just had sex with an angel. However, her reliance would also be her downfall, as once the man saw a bulletin out for Sheila's arrest, he immediately called the police and informed them of her whereabouts. And unfortunately, for Sheila, this was the end of the road for her. She was officially arrested for the murder of Kenneth Countie. Following her arrest, a 3-week search at the ranch officially began, and what officers found there would seriously turn their stomachs. They found burn piles which dated back as far as 2004, therefore confirming that Sheila had done this more than just once. Through their investigation, they would positively identify another victim, Michael Deloge. His demise was revealed when they checked the septic tank located on the property. They found Michael's birth certificate, a spent shell case, and a couple of bones floating in the stagnant water. Testing the bone against Michael's mother's DNA came back positive. 3 human toes were also located on the ranch's grounds, along with many personal items that could not be linked to any existing victim or known individual. One of the most disturbing pieces of evidence recovered from the scene were homemade videotapes. And here, Sheila recorded the confessions of Michael Deloge and Kenneth Countie. Under her torture, they untruthfully confessed that they were the perpetrators of a multitude of crimes. Now, we wouldn't expect Sheila to go down quietly, would we? During her trial in 2008, she pleaded not guilty on the grounds of insanity. Sheila claimed that when she was in a coma in the 1980s, she had met God. Apparently, he had told her to protect the children of this earth, and to stop what had happened to her when she was young happening to them. Sheila sees herself as an unofficial angel, there to get rid of the sex criminals of New Hampshire. Many psychologists had screened Sheila over the 2 years she was awaiting trial. Some said she seemed psychotic and delusional, while others believed she had an extreme personality disorder exacerbated by a mistreatment in earlier life. Did Sheila truly believe that she was sent by God to get rid of these men? Or had her previous life experiences and a disorder nurtured a growing hate? Had her 2 known victims really committed these crimes? Or was it all her sick fantasy? After much deliberation, Sheila's insanity plea was formally denied. Sheila may have had an extreme personality disorder, but she was obviously high functioning. She also knew what she had done was wrong, as she had tried to destroy evidence and flee from law enforcement when she was caught red-handed. And for all of this, in June of 2008, Sheila LaBarre was found guilty for the murders of Michael Deloge and Kenneth Countie. She was given 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. There was sadly not enough evidence to sentence her for any other murders. However, even to this date, there are still many unexplained items and even human remains found at the ranch. Investigators would find 3 severed human toes on the property, but these were confirmed not to belong to Michael or Kenny. So, is there a victim number 3? This would put Sheila LaBarre in the serial killer category, and considering the evidence, it is extremely likely. It's a real tragedy to consider Sheila's actions. She preyed on the weak and vulnerable to fulfill her fantasies. And perhaps in her own deluded world, it was her so-called vengeance, but personally, I'm not buying it. There is room for debate over her psychological condition, as she had suffered numerous head injuries throughout her life, some of which are as far back as childhood. It is an area in psychology that we are yet to fully understand, so we cannot be sure. What we can be sure of is that Sheila took the lives of 2 innocent men. Both of these men were vulnerable people, and in their time of need, Sheila exploited the opportunity to make them her pets. Sheila never really cared for Kenny Countie or Michael Deloge. She's a master manipulator and a hypersexual, selfish gold digger who deserves the hand that she has been dealt. The only kind of locking up that she now gets to experience is of herself behind bars. And so concludes our case of the BDSM horse ranch serial killer. The name's still a work in progress. Thank you so much for watching another video today by Coffeehouse Crime. If you found this video interesting or insightful, then please remember to like the video and subscribe if you haven't yet. Please remember to share your thoughts on this case in the comment section down below. And as always, I'll be back again real soon for another video. But until that moment arrives, please remember to look after each other. Goodbye.